Power is seductive, but in the hands of kings it becomes something else entirely. A slow, rotting poison that seeps into the mind. These weren't rulers with eccentric quirks or misunderstood brilliance. These were monarchs who dissolved into madness so complete, their empires became living nightmares. One of them believed he was made of glass. He refused to move or be touched, terrified he would shatter into 1,000 splinters. His royal robes were lined with iron rods. Another forced his entire court to crawl on hands and knees pretending to be toy soldiers, while he held military tribunals. For rats. One king ate himself to death in a grotesque feast that ended with cream spilling from his lips and his stomach bursting inside him. Another collected pubic hair from his lovers, stitched it into wigs, and gifted them to a secret club that kissed the wig in solemn rituals. These were real men, real rulers with real kingdoms. And they ruled not with reason, but with disease. This is what happens when no one can say no to a mad king. History loves to crown kings, but it rarely warns us what happens when a man becomes untouchable. When no one can stop your commands, when every breath you take is law, when your sickness is interpreted as divinity, the line between human and monster disappears. Throughout every era, Byzantine, Ottoman, Roman, European, we find the same disturbing pattern. A young king takes the throne, often intelligent, sometimes compassionate. But slowly, over years, something begins to rot inside him. He becomes paranoid. He stops sleeping. He begins to hurt those closest to him. Not because he's evil, but because no one ever told him he was wrong. Servants learn to smile as they serve food laced with hair. Physicians nod as kings devour mercury, believing it will make them immortal. Generals play along as battles are fought using wooden soldiers. Ministers bow to dogs, statues, ghosts, and through it all, silence. No one dares speak. This isn't just madness. It's the byproduct of unchecked power, a psychological cage that turns men into gods in their own minds and prisoners in everyone else's. And the damage doesn't stay behind palace walls. When kings go mad, entire kingdoms bleed. In the next 13 chapters, you'll meet the most deranged rulers in history, men whose habits were not just bizarre, but soul-destroying. These stories aren't fables. They're documented historical horrors, told by courtiers, diplomats, and terrified servants who lived through them. This is the dark side of the crown, and the madness it leaves behind. He ruled France, but lived in fear of being shattered like a wine glass dropped on stone. Charles VI, known later as Charles the Mad, ascended the French throne in 1380. At first he was young, charming, and capable. But beneath the crown, something deeply fragile began to crack. As his reign continued, Charles developed a terrifying delusion. He was made entirely of glass. Not metaphorically. He believed his bones, his skin, even his blood, were crystal clear and brittle. Any wrong move, any touch from another human being, might cause him to explode into splinters. He stopped walking without permission. He stood still for hours, frozen like a statue. His tailors were ordered to sew iron rods into his royal robes to protect his delicate body. He refused to sit on chairs, refused to ride horses, and banned anyone from standing near him. His servants tiptoed around him, whispering like mourners at a funeral. And in the moments when his mind didn't fear glass, it feared everything else. During one psychotic break, Charles attacked his own knights with a sword, believing they were traitors sent to assassinate him. France, locked in war and debt, had no king anymore, only a man trapped in a glass prison of his own invention. And no one could tell him he was insane. By the end of his reign, the Emperor of Byzantium was no longer a ruler, but a creature of shrieks, teeth, and terror. Justin II took the imperial throne in 565 AD, stepping into the legacy of one of the world's greatest empires. But his mind began to unravel almost immediately. Chroniclers described his behavior as raging madness, and they weren't exaggerating. At first there were whispers that the emperor had fits of uncontrollable rage, that he struck out at courtiers for no reason, that he chewed on cloth and muttered to himself for hours. But then the screaming began. Justin would wake in the night howling like a wounded animal, running through the palace halls barefoot, biting his own hands. He bit his servants, lunged at guests, and tried more than once to jump from windows, convinced he was being hunted by demons. The palace became a fortress of whispered prayers and locked doors. Music, the only thing that soothed him, was ordered to be played constantly in the background. Harps, lyres, choirs. The empire's grand halls were transformed into a madhouse with a soundtrack. In the end, his advisors locked him away while ruling in his name. Byzantium carried on, but its emperor had vanished, swallowed by his own mind. Teeth bared, screaming into the dark. He shone like the sun, yet stank of decay and perfume. Two sides of a dying monarch. Louis XIV, the Sun King, reigned over France for 72 years. His court sparkled with silk and gold. But behind closed doors, his body revolted. Though he sat atop the most advanced medical court in Europe, Louis bathed just 3 times in his life. His skin, pale and crusted with grime, became a breeding ground for lice so vast that courtiers claimed they could hear them crawling on his flesh. To mask the putrid stench, the king filled Versailles' corridors with perfumed flowers, burning incense in endless braziers. He sat upon a toilet throne, an ornate commode placed on a raised dais commanding ministers to bow before him, even as he relieved himself. His vanity warred with his decay. Every morning, courtiers prostrated themselves to smear scented oils across his skin, as if a few drops of lavender could erase ulcers festering beneath his royal robes. Behind that gilded mask lay a body rotting from neglect, a physical echo of the decadence and cruelty that would scar France for decades. Power, he discovered, cannot cleanse the soul or the flesh. By the end of his reign, Henry VIII wasn't a king. He was a monstrous mass of fear, flesh, and festering wounds. The once vibrant ruler who had danced, jousted, and seduced his way through England's court transformed into something terrifying. Obsessed with death and convinced everyone around him was trying to kill him. He trusted no one, not even his clothes. Every morning, servants were ordered to kiss his bedsheets to check for poison. His meals were tasted by multiple testers. But his fear went deeper. Even new garments had to be tested by courtiers before he would wear them, a grotesque performance where men inhaled cloth, held it to their tongues, swore it clean. Beneath his robes, his leg oozed pus from a never-healed jousting wound. The infection stank so badly that visitors gagged in his presence. He wore padded armor, not for battle, but to keep his own body from leaking through. His court lived in terror not of enemies, but of his mood. A single glance could mean execution. A whispered word could cost a life. And through it all, Henry sat rotting in paranoia, king of a crumbling body, prisoner of his own decaying mind. In Eric XIV's kingdom, silence could save your life, but a whisper could get you killed. When Eric took the Swedish throne in 1560, he was young, brilliant, and idealistic. But brilliance can rot just like flesh, and his mind darkened quickly. At first, the signs were subtle: isolation, insomnia, frantic letters to invisible enemies. But soon paranoia consumed him. He became convinced that everyone, nobles, servants, even his own brothers, were plotting to destroy him. One day, 2 men laughed quietly in a corridor. Eric overheard. They didn't know it yet, but they were already dead. He began ordering executions for whispering, for glancing at him too long, for speaking too softly near his quarters. But the most disturbing moment came in 1567. A nobleman, Niels Sture, knelt before the king in court, pleading his innocence. Eric stared at him in silence. Then, without warning, he pulled a knife and stabbed Niels repeatedly, screaming. Blood pooled on the royal floor, and no one stopped him. The court wept in silence. The king had become a butcher. Eric's reign spiraled into madness until his own half-brother deposed him. He died in a cell, poisoned, a fitting end for a man who trusted no one and deserved no trust. His harem was a prison, his palace a slaughterhouse, his empire a nightmare stitched from silk and screams. Sultan Ibrahim I of the Ottoman Empire, remembered in history as Ibrahim the Mad, ruled not with strategy or vision, but with lust, rage, and blood. Imprisoned since childhood in the Ottoman Golden Cage, a palace chamber where princes were kept in isolation to avoid assassination, Ibrahim emerged a broken man. His mind, deprived of sunlight and human love, collapsed inward. And when the crown was forced upon him, his desires spilled out like poison. He became obsessed with obese women, demanding his agents scour the empire for the heaviest concubines imaginable. Dozens, hundreds, were brought to his chambers, weighed, measured, and judged. But desire soon turned to terror. Convinced that his concubines were unfaithful, Ibrahim ordered 280 women drowned in the Bosphorus, their bodies stuffed in sacks, their screams silenced beneath the waves. One woman survived. Her testimony revealed horrors beyond imagination: nightly rapes, sadistic punishments, and girls chained in darkness for weeks. The Sultan also fed coins to palace fish, believing it made them holy. He ordered walls lined with fur so only softness touched his skin. In 1648, the empire's patience ended. His own guards strangled him with a silk cord, but the memory of the drowned women would haunt Constantinople for centuries. He ruled a kingdom, but couldn't rule his appetite. Adolf Frederick of Sweden was no tyrant. In fact, history remembers him as mild, even kind. But his legacy isn't written in laws or wars. It's written in lard, cream, and pastry. On February 12, 1771, the king sat down for a celebratory meal. What followed was a grotesque performance of royal indulgence. He devoured lobster, sauerkraut, caviar, kippers, and washed it all down with copious champagne. But the main event was dessert: 14 semlas, heavy Swedish cream buns soaked in warm milk, dense with almond paste. His stomach stretched, his breathing slowed, but he kept eating. By the final bun, the king clutched his chest. He collapsed shortly after, vomiting blood and froth. His stomach had ruptured from pressure. He died writhing in agony, his bloated corpse requiring special handling. Physicians couldn't help. They could only record it. The king had eaten himself to death. Foreign courts laughed behind closed doors. Sweden had become a joke. But beneath the absurdity was a warning. Even in peace, even in decadence, a king without limits will destroy himself. Adolf's last words were never recorded, only the menu. He turned the forbidden city into a circus, and the empire into a joke. Emperor Zhengde of the Ming dynasty ruled China from 1505 to 1521. He inherited the world's most advanced bureaucracy, a civilization of scholars, philosophers, poets. But Zhengde wanted none of it. He built a secret pleasure palace within the forbidden city called the Leopard Quarter, a fantasy compound filled with exotic animals, jesters, dwarfs, and concubines dressed as soldiers, monks, and animals. Every day he forced his ministers to role-play absurd dramas. Diplomats from Persia and Arabia were made to wear clown costumes during trade meetings. He took no interest in governance. Instead, he wrestled leopards, rode tigers in parades, and staged mock battles where eunuchs pretended to invade his throne. Once he vanished for weeks, only to return dressed as a traveling merchant, demanding taxes from his own subjects in disguise. Officials wrote desperate letters. The emperor believes he is a god, a child, and a beast, all in one day. But no one could stop him. When he died in a drunken boating accident at 29, he left no heir, no reform, only chaos. Zhengde had turned the might of China into a playground, and the world laughed as it burned. He ruled a desert kingdom of gold, and still couldn't stop stealing. King Farouk ascended the Egyptian throne in 1936, draped in royal robes and surrounded by unimaginable wealth. But beneath the silk and diamonds was a man with a mind diseased by compulsion, a pathological thief who couldn't stop taking what wasn't his. He once stole Winston Churchill's pocket watch during a diplomatic visit, slipping it from the prime minister's waistcoat like a street pickpocket. At dinner parties, he swiped fountain pens, lighters, earrings, even ashtrays. But it didn't end there. After a nightmare in which he was mauled by lions, Farouk awoke in terror and ordered his guards to execute every lion in Cairo's zoo by dawn. Dozens of animals were slaughtered because of a king's dream. His obsession spiraled. He outlawed red cars for anyone but himself, maintaining a fleet of over 200 crimson vehicles. Citizens who disobeyed were imprisoned. He amassed what may have been the world's largest porn collection, housed in a sealed wing of the palace. Entire days were spent cataloging erotic films, while the country sank deeper into poverty. In 1952, Egypt had enough. A military coup ended his reign. He fled to Europe, bloated, bitter, and clutching a suitcase full of stolen jewelry. His crown was gone, but his hands never stopped reaching. Some kings collect gold, others collect land. Charles II of England collected pubic hair. When the monarchy was restored in 1660, Charles returned to power like a man reborn, but not in virtue, in vice. His court was infamous for debauchery. Dozens of mistresses, countless affairs. But it wasn't the quantity that disturbed his advisors. It was what he kept from them. Charles became obsessed with collecting his lover's pubic hair. He would snip it himself during their most intimate moments and store the trimmings in velvet-lined cases. Over time, he amassed a private library of labeled hair samples, each tagged with a name, a date, and sometimes a quote from their final night together. But it didn't stop at storage. Charles had wigs made from these trophies, which he gifted to an elite Scottish drinking club. These men would wear the wigs during ceremonies, toast the women, and kiss the hair as part of a perverse ritual meant to honor royal lust. Rumors of the practice spread through Europe. Diplomats whispered that England's king wasn't just lustful, he was sick. Charles died at 54, not in battle, not by poison, but surrounded by wigs and secrets best left buried. He was crowned king, but ruled like a mad child in a costume too big to wear. Christian VII of Denmark took the throne at just 17. What followed was not a reign, but a collapse. His mind quickly fragmented, lost in masturbation, hallucinations, and cruel games. Every morning began the same way. Self-pleasure, publicly and compulsively. He did it during meals, during council meetings, even in church. Courtiers developed coded signals to warn guests before he exposed himself. He forced dignitaries, elderly men, ambassadors, generals to play leapfrog in the palace halls. Anyone who refused was stripped of position. Those who obeyed crawled through humiliation, praying the game would end. His favorite advisor was his pet dog, whom he named a royal minister. The animal had an official title, a salary, and a seat at the table, often barking during budget meetings while Christian nodded in approval. Meals were chaos. He'd eat food off the floor, bite silverware, or refuse to eat for days, claiming it was poison. Then he'd gorge until vomiting. The kingdom was ruled by puppets. His physician, his lovers, his enemies. Christian was no longer king. He was a captive of impulse. In Denmark, a playground for a broken mind. He believed he was a god. His people believed he was death. Caligula ruled the Roman Empire from 37 to 41 AD, 4 short years that drenched the empire in fear, blood, and absurdity. Early on, he was hailed as a savior, young, charming, generous. But then something broke. He began conversing with statues, asking them for advice. When they didn't respond, he had them beheaded. He declared war on the sea, ordering his legions to stab the waves and collect seashells as spoils of battle. But the most disturbing symbol of his madness? His horse, Incitatus. Caligula built him a marble stall, a golden feeding trough, and an ivory manger. He fed him wine from jeweled goblets and considered him a priest and future senator. He even planned to give the horse voting power in the Roman Senate. The emperor began dressing as gods, sometimes Jupiter, other times Venus, and forced citizens to worship him or die. His parties turned into blood rituals. He executed guests mid-feast, sometimes for treason, sometimes for yawning. Rome, exhausted and horrified, finally revolted. His own guards stabbed him to death in a hallway. The divine monster was dead. But the empire never forgot what happens when power believes it's holy. He built castles for imaginary kings and hosted banquets for the dead. Ludwig II of Bavaria, crowned in 1864, is remembered not for war or law, but for obsession. He ruled not a kingdom, but a personal fantasy, crafted from stone, opera, and delusion. He poured the state's fortune into building Neuschwanstein and other fairy tale castles. Architectural hallucinations shaped by medieval legends and Wagnerian opera. But inside those stone dreamscapes, reality unraveled. Ludwig would host formal dinners for long-dead monarchs, insisting place settings be arranged for Charlemagne, Louis XII, and Frederick the Great. Servants were forced to serve courses to empty chairs, while Ludwig conversed with ghosts, nodded at silent replies, and toasted the past. He reversed court life, slept all day, ruled at night, wandered candle-lit halls in capes and crowns, reciting opera solos to invisible crowds. He believed himself to be Parsifal, Siegfried, or a holy king fated never to die. Ministers pleaded for him to return to governance, but Ludwig insisted that dreams were more important than law. Bavaria bankrupted itself building his fantasies. Finally, he was declared insane and removed from power. Days later, he was found drowned in Lake Starnberg beside his psychiatrist. A mystery unsolved, a king lost in his own myth. Power doesn't just reveal who a man is, it accelerates his decay. 13 kings, 13 minds destroyed not by war or disease, but by the unbearable weight of unchecked authority. They weren't born monsters. Some began as visionaries, poets, warriors, thinkers. But as the years passed and the crowns sat heavier on their heads, something darker took root. The palace became a cage. The silence of fear replaced truth. And the king, once a man, became a god in his own eyes and a terror in everyone else's. Their habits weren't merely eccentric. They were grotesque rituals of disconnection. Men who drowned their lovers, wore the dead, ate themselves to death, or demanded worship from marble statues. What links them isn't madness, it's isolation. In a world where no one can correct you, the mind unravels. Power without boundaries warps memory, dulls empathy, and amplifies the darkest whispers inside the brain. And when that power wears a crown, the consequences aren't just personal, they're national. Cities burn, kingdoms rot, and history is left with ruins, haunted not by war but by the madness of one man. 13 crowns, 13 catastrophes. These weren't just rulers. They were warnings. Proof that even the strongest empires can fall, not from outside attacks, but from madness within the throne room. Which king disturbed you the most? Let us know in the comments. And if you want more true stories where history turns horrifying, subscribe. Because the past doesn't whisper, it screams.